her. And I really look forward to an interesting discussion. So the name of today's talk is Displacement and Re-invention, Post-War Russian Immigration from Europe. Sheila Fitzpatrick, as you probably know, is a historian of modern Russia and 20th century migration. She's a professor at the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, and Distinguished Service Professor Emerita of the University of Chicago. Her recent books include On Stalin's Tea, The Years of Living Dangerously in Soviet Politics, which was published in 2015, Misha's War, published in 2017, White Russians Red Pearl, A Cold War History of Migration to Australia, recently published in 2021, and The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, recently published in 2022. So no lack of productivity there. And those of you thinking about assigning texts for courses in the coming year, we'll be happy to hear about the shortest history of the Soviet Union, probably.
Which is even published here by Columbia University Press.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. We'll probably be assigning that in our core legacies class next year. She is currently writing a book on Soviet and Baltic displaced persons after the Second World War called Lost Souls, and it will be published by Princeton University Press. Our moderator today is Professor of History, Catherine Yevtukov. And Catherine, you want to talk about the format, and then just we'll take over and allow Sheila to give her remarks.
Okay, sure. Yes, Elise asked me to take questions and moderate. So we've asked Sheila, please, to speak for maybe about 40 minutes or so. And after that, we'll open it to questions. It's completely simple and straightforward. I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing.
Yeah, we really are. So welcome. And also, I should mention that she just flew here from Australia. So,
well, not quite as bad as that.
oh,
From London. No, but before that, I came from Australia, and that was quite as bad as you could possibly imagine. I mean.
Okay.
So shall I? Now, what I don't really know is who you are, except for the people I do know. And are you mainly historians and political science?
Well, would you like? I mean, it would be nice to go around for everyone to introduce it. Maybe it's better to do it before you talk.
Yes,
after. Okay, let's do that then. Great. To just tell us in a few words who you are.
Okay, my name is Leo. I'm a senior student, MIA. My focus on political economy in China, especially.
Okay. Master of International Affairs.
I'm Alexander Verdikin. I'm a Russian journalist currently at Columbia University's School of Journalism for a one-year main program. I'm working at an embedded media publication about criminal justice and elder office.
Hi, I'm Tyler Atkins. I'm actually an anthropologist and I'm a postdoc here at the Harriman Institute.
I'm Andrew Sloan. I'm a professor of Russian, Soviet, and Jewish history at Burke College.
I'm Sheila Fitzpatrick, and I'm a PhD student at Princeton University, and I'm an 80% Russian bio. I'm Karisma Antidu. I'm a PhD student in the history department, and I work on the Russian immigration. Very excited.
I'm Marta Milewska, and I'm a visiting scholar from Florence, and I work on bra industry production in Poland.
I'm Susanna, and I'm a first year and research at the Harriman Institute.
Adrian, I'm a second year student at the Harriman Institute.
Boris Gasparov, Slavic languages, formerly displaced person.
I'm Alex. I'm also a master's student at the Harriman Institute.
Hi, I'm Daria Franklin. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia Sociology Department, Historical Sociology. I do Soviet literary field.
I'm Laura. I'm an alumni. I studied philosophy and worked in media.
Yes, and this reminded me that some of the people in this room were present on the Zoom screen when Professor Fitzpatrick spoke to us on a related topic, I guess a year ago now, for the Slavic seminar, and it was a wonderful event. We were all very excited, and it's almost beyond belief that we actually have her within touchable distance. So it's delightful. Okay, so I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, we were locked down for 2 years in Australia. And who would have expected that that would happen? I mean, really locked down. You were not allowed to travel internationally. I mean, the pandemic broadened one's horizons in all kinds of ways. I mean, in other words, broadening one's sense of the possible. So yes, I'm going to talk again about immigration and displacement, and particularly about the reinvention that goes with that. And I am in a way going to talk about it from the perspective of a historian, because that's the context in which I deal with it. On the other hand, it also obviously has a lot of contemporary relevance. Displacement and migration even has contemporary relevance to me. So I hope that what I say won't seem too disciplinarily focused. I hope it will be interesting for people coming from a variety of intellectual discipline. So migration and displacement are both about changing places, but migration is understood as a matter of intention, displacement as an accident, becoming a refugee. Some refugees spend years, even a lifetime, in holding camps, and that is a topic of great interest in itself, although I'm focusing today on those who have not only become displaced, but are subsequently resettled, that whole process. Refugee resettlement and ordinary migration are similar processes, although there's a smaller element of choice and agency in the former. In both cases, people who were formerly living in one place, part of one society and culture, citizens of one state, holding its passport and speaking generally one language, travel through space and end up after various adventures living in another place, part of another society and culture, citizen or resident alien of another state, perhaps with a different passport and speaking a different language. They have migrated. When the census comes around in this new state, these migrants will be recorded among those born elsewhere. The fact of having been born and brought up elsewhere will also remain, of course, in their memory, more or less vivid. Their status as, in brackets, ex-foreigners will also not be forgotten. They may brood on the circumstances that uprooted them, dwelling on their victimhood. More rarely, they may see themselves as having seized opportunities or made the best of a difficult situation. They may try to acculturate, they will probably try to acculturate in the new place, but their children are almost bound to do it better. They may prefer to stick with their own kind, other foreigners with the same language and background, but their children, when grown, are likely to move away. The migrants may dream of returning home or angrily repudiate any such thought, any idea that they want to go back, or in rare cases actually return. For a social historian, displacement and migration are really terrific topics, though I think this isn't generally recognized as one of the key areas. History is, after all, about change, and social history is about people in societies. Migration and displacement gives us change along multiple dimensions, with individuals with different trajectories being detached from one social setting and via a period of transit put down in another. The presentation of self, the individual's presentation of self, including, of course, their misrepresentation of self, is to the fore, and it's bound to change with the change of locus. Memory, nostalgia for a lost past, is generally strongly present. For the migrant, I think there must always be a parallel track, more or less on the surface, more or less visible to others, according to individual predilection and circumstance, a parallel track between the present resettled life and the past pre-displacement one. In other words, they coexist in one's mental world. Now, I might even raise my claim, or raise the claim for the importance of migration displacement as a social history topic, and say it should be perhaps put at the very center social historians' interest. Displacement belongs to that liminal space between individual and community that casts both into particularly strong relief. The individual migrants have to reinvent themselves. If they come with family, that in itself poses interesting challenges because within a family, the elder members don't always reinvent themselves in the same way. In other words, they tell different stories. There have been some quite interesting examples of that in television documentaries and so on. So some reinvent more enthusiastically than others, but spouses at least more or less know each other's original backstory. However, the children don't necessarily, and there's the question of what to tell the children about the past and what version of the past and of the place of origin to present. Out of one community into another where they don't initially fit, the migrants have to decide whether to opt for total immersion or just putting in a toe, that is, for example, immersion in an ethnic community in the new country. The local ethnic community, meanwhile, is interpreting, reinventing past national community. This is a major part of the imaginative work of people who resettled. With abundant invention of tradition. I always think of the example of the in the DP camps, the displaced camps in Europe after the war. The really significant developments, as I understand it, I'm not a specialist in weaving, but within the techniques of weaving described as traditionally national and Latvian. This appears to have been quite the contribution of the DP camps, where you're of course no longer in a national community, or the original national community is very large. There is likely to be a growing divergence between what nationality and national patriotism mean back home, mean in the place of origin, and what it means in the diaspora. Now, I'm now going to say something about how I come at this topic before making some remarks which are quite largely drawn from that book, which is about Russian and Soviet and Russian migrants who ended up in Australia after the Second World War. So I'll be referring to that work, but also to the broader implications of it and the thoughts that it provoked in me on these questions. Now, before I ever started doing anything about migration or immigration or Russian emigres, I was a Soviet historian, and I still am a Soviet historian, so I'm a bit of a two-track person now. But one of the works, one of the things that I did in as a Soviet historian, Soviet social historian, was a book called Tear Off the Masks: Identity and Imposture in 20th Century Russia. And that really got me into a lot of these questions about reinvention of self when circumstances change radically. Now, the radical change in circumstance in Tear Off the Masks was revolution. It wasn't migration, but revolution. But the notion that you suddenly have to become a new person. You meet new people, and you describe yourself in different terms. This is a process that goes on after a revolution, as also after migration. Then I did a book, this is 2014, a book, A Spy in the Archives. Now that is not about migration. This is a memoir of my being a British exchange student in Moscow in the late 1960s. But again, I mean, the experience is relevant. The experience of being a person from one culture dumped down in another one, in that case, a very ambiguous situation. You're not a migrant, of course, it's an exchange student. Your visa would run out. By no means would you be you couldn't possibly stay even had you wanted to. So you have it's an unusual. It's another angle on being an outsider in a society. Then I did a book called Mishka's War, subtitled The European Odyssey of the 1940s. That was 2015. And that was about my husband, Michael Danos, who was a physicist born in Riga, who found himself as a displaced person in the camps in Europe, and actually was able to use the occasion rather profitably, in that he finished his training as an electrical engineer, and then he went off at Hanover, then he went off to Heidelberg and got a PhD in physics. For that book, that's what got me interested in the experience of displacement, because I had a wonderful source, and now this is historian speaking. As soon as they start to tell you like a wonderful source, you know they're going to go on and be terribly boring. But I will just tell you that Misha and his mother, most fortunately, were both DPs in Germany, but in different cities. Therefore, in those days, they wrote letters on which they put a stamp, and they sent them through the mail, and they were kept. And so now I have to say that Misha's mother was a much better correspondent than he was, but nevertheless, it's a back and forth. How are you doing? What are the possibilities there? And how the people we knew from Riga doing? It's just a really and then comes the question: where are we going to go? Because it's a finite thing. Being in a displaced person's camp, the assumption is that you've got to try and get yourself somewhere else. And so they have this big conversation about where should that place be. Anyway, I'll come back to the Misha story, because it's one of the formative things for me, I think, in thinking about displacement and migration. Then I did White Russians, Red Peril. That was you might say, my back to Australia book. In other words, I never done any Australian history. But my thought then was that in Russia and in Australia, who cares about Russia or Ukraine? Now, wrong. Everybody now cares about it. But as of 2012, it was not up there as a national concern. And so I thought I need to work on something that interests people here and interests me as well. And that's that book. And Amy's already mentioned the Lost Souls, which is my the Cold War conflict over Soviet and Baltic displaced persons after World War II, which is using the same archival material as that which I had gathered before the pandemic. So in a way, it's a lockdown book, but not Australia focused. In other words, focused on the broader global process of resettlement as well as repatriation. Now, I'll just throw in a little bit of the personal stuff, partly because I just wrote something I wrote something for the London Review of Books on passports. And in it, I said, I present myself as the holder of 3 different passports, and indeed I am. There I probably even have, yes, undoubtedly, I have them they are here with me. And having three different passports is quite a strange thing, because it used to be, you used to worry that it would be considered illegitimate to have more than one passport. Now that is not the case. And so you would have the other one, but you wouldn't show it. Now that has really changed, so that people like me are normal, but it does mean, it means you leave a funny trail behind, because I leave Australia showing my Australian passport, but also showing that if I'm going to the UK, that's one of my passports. I have to show I leave Australia as an Australian, and I arrive in Britain as British. This is what I did in September. I then came here on Sunday, and I left Britain as British, and I arrived here as a US citizen. And that all sounds terribly underhand, but that is what you are in fact instructed to do. So these are Australia, UK, and the US are the 3 different places I've lived in, although of course I've also spent quite a lot of time in the Soviet Union, as always, as a visitor, but nevertheless, over time that all adds up. Yes, and Misha, Michael Downer's my husband, the one the book's about. He was born in Riga of a Latvian Hungarian family that spoke at home Russian, German, Latvian, and Italian because they were opera singers. The Italian was because of the opera singers. Anyway, a complex identification when you were at home, but when you become displaced, it quickly becomes a simple one. You become Latvian. Latvian is what is on your DP card. No complications about Hungarian, Jewish, Latvian, whatever. No, it's you're now Latvian. So yes, back to me. Although I'm not even quite sure why I need to tell you this, but anyway, I suppose I need to prove my credentials as a migrant. In 1964, I left Australia and went to the UK. That was for graduate school, but I didn't intend to go back, so I counted it as migration. Then I came to the US in the early 70s, and in the 70s, I had an office in 1207, as I've just worked out, which isn't an office anymore, as far as I can see, but it was. And then in 2012, I went back to Australia, although not to my hometown. That seemed to be going a bit far. But this year, I went back to my hometown, which is Melbourne, after being 58 years away. So I have very good personal credentials as a migrant, I would say. So let me now talk a little bit about my displaced persons. Well, I'll very briefly describe the group I'm talking about. At the end of the Second World War, there were about 5 million Soviet displaced Soviet prisoners of war and forced laborers in Germany and Austria, of whom the majority were returned by the spring of 1946, but that left about 1 million of them. And they were people who didn't want to repatriate. So what to do with them? They were being looked after, first of all, by UNRWA, the International Refugee Organization. And UNRWA's notion was that they should be persuaded to repatriate, if possible. But that was their view, but the Soviet ones, but to voluntarily repatriate. But repatriation was UNRWA's general mission for the displaced persons. UNRWA gave way to IRO, the International Refugee Organization, in 1947, and IRO's sense of its basic mission was different. Its mission now became resettlement, finding places outside Europe for these people to go. And in the event, the largest number went to the United States. So the United States took a while to open up. Second largest went to Australia. And given that the population of Australia was about 7 million at the time, that in Australian terms was huge. Then Israel and Canada are the other big recipients. And that whole process is a complicated one. I'll say more about that in the context of process. So the people the displaced people that I've looked at, I've been dealing with, there are basically two lots of them. There are the ones that were previously Soviet citizens, and that means that by nationality they may be a variety, they may be Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Jewish, Armenian, whatever. Now, actually, one should further divide that among the former Soviet citizens, are the ones who were citizens of the Soviet Union before the war, and the ones from Western, what became Western Belarus, Western Ukraine, the ones that were involuntarily brought into the Soviet Union, incorporated into the Soviet Union as a result of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So that's one lot, or two lots, depending how you want to see it. And then the other lot are people, are Russians, who were, and some other nationalities too, but predominantly Russians, who left after the revolution and were in Europe in between the war. Those people were mainly stateless. That was their formal situation, whereas the Soviet citizens, if they choose to claim it, they remain Soviet citizens. There is because the people that came, because the displaced persons from the Soviet Union were claimed by the Soviets as their citizens, and the Soviets wanted to get them back and felt that they should be forcibly returned regardless of whether they wanted to go or not. There were substantial disadvantages if you didn't want to repatriate of being identified as a Soviet, as former Soviet in your documents. It was better to try and pass as to become stateless, so to speak, to invent a pass for yourself in the emigration, in the pre-war emigration, and in many camps, in camps where there were both kinds of Russians. In fact, there was almost an industry of producing stateless documents for the Soviets. Now, once one's talking about producing stateless, producing documents, it's clear what at least some of the practices of self-invention are. I mean, part of self-invention can occur in various ways, but one of the ways is to produce a new file self, as it's sometimes called. In other words, to produce a new set of characteristics that are entered into official documents which you show, like passports, to show who you are. And it was extremely important. This was an issue where when you, mainly in general, when you were the displaced person was a status that you essentially applied to. I mean, you had to be approved to have the quality, the characteristic of being a displaced person. And once you're a displaced person, you had a nationality. And that often determined what camp you were in and therefore what sort of local community that you had. But it was important not was important to most people didn't have original documents, or if they had, it was better to dispose of them. So there's a great deal of self-assignation of identity. Of course, this is qualified by the fact that you ought to be able to speak the language that you claim to be a citizen of the country you claim to be a citizen of. But it's clear that that there was a lot of fudge room actually of this. For example, the IRO, the UNRWA and IRO officials and the occupation officials, they normally didn't know any Slavic languages. They are dependent on interpreters. So somebody who is in fact from the Soviet Union but thinks it would be better to call himself Czech or Pole or West Ukrainian or something, and can, but doesn't really speak the language, could be told. Anybody who's a native speaker would know that this person is not a native speaker. But on the other hand, the interpreter is probably another DP, and that interpreter is probably sympathetic. And so it was, I think, quite often quite possible for, let's say, a native Russian speaker to claim to be a Polish speaker, and as long as that to be backed up by the interpreter, and therefore for IRO to simply take it without question. Now, nationality was also important in that IRO is out there trying to get countries to offer for the migrants. In other words, to say they'll take a certain number, and these countries generally or in many cases, specify what kind of people they would like to take. Now, in general, the overwhelmingly popular kind of migrant is single male, healthy manual laborer. these are the very best qualities. The IRO and under both, they had in their constitution rules against any discrimination on the part of host nations on grounds of race or religion. But they allowed people to state national preferences, and these were stated usually not exactly stated in published documents, but in the archives there of this. Australia, for example, had it had an absolute, it had a clearly delineated hierarchy of the nationalities it wanted. The Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians at the top, and then Slovenes. Let me see if I can remember the whole. You go down. Czechs, I think, were up there. Ukrainians were quite high. Poles were low, and Jews were at the bottom. That was, and this is quite openly discussed in the private correspondence of the Australian immigration. And I think now Australia was considered by IRO to be a bit brazen about this, but it wasn't really unusual. I mean, that kind of preference was often expressed and more often practiced. Lots and lots of adjustments of nationality to suit demand, basically. As I worked on individual cases, I became familiar with many standard kind of misrepresentations of self, not only the one involving nationality. Reducing your age was standard. If you were hitting 40, many of the countries had an explicit or implicit preference for younger people. So that Misha's mother, for example, took 10 years off her age. She was early 40s, I think, born at the beginning of the century. Her sister took even more, actually. Elder sister, I think the older sister became slightly younger. But anyway, so that was standard. I found a very nice case of the first ship of ship of displaced persons that went to Australia was the SS General Heinzelmann, and it was all Baltic displaced persons because that was Australia's preference. Beautiful bolts was how they were referred to in the local press, and they were represented to the press as being all blonde and blue-eyed and hence desirable. But the selection process also, as I've mentioned, emphasized the desirability of manual laborers. So on the SS Heinzelmann, there were however many people there were, with the majority of them identifying as manual laborers in terms of their past occupation, or domestic servants, or sometimes nurses, and so on. So that's how the boat set off, and it takes about 6 weeks, probably took them 8 weeks to get to Australia. And by the time they got to Australia, a remarkable transformation had occurred. An immigration official got on board and basically interviewed people individually, saying, "Who are you? Who are you?" And suddenly the boat was full of professors of theology, opera singers, these people who had been building laborers have suddenly metamorphosed into something, I suppose, closer to their true self. I don't want to say that the one was a lie and the other one was the absolute truth. But in any case, it was they obviously the immigration official who was in a sense departing from, he was going on another implicit criteria, which is educated people are good for our society and upper class people, and of course, English speakers. And English speakers are not really, building laborers are not likely to be English speakers, but professors of theology maybe. So anyway, that there's one of the few occasions where one has a whole shipload with one set of social characteristics at the beginning of the voyage and another set on the time of arrival. Now, another thing that is extremely likely to be to be reformulated in one's past is pre-war and wartime marriages, excessive marriages in other cases. I mean, this is not only the displaced persons. I think migration often anybody familiar with migrants have probably heard the stories about how there was actually a marriage back in wherever, but better to sort of, well, we've forgotten about that one. So that's a very standard thing. And there's also a complex set of practices involving marriage to be resettled, marrying the right kind of person to be resettled in the place you want to be. Because if I said single people are preferred, but nevertheless married without children are okay too. And in some cases, it may be that the nationality of the one gives advantages, which both of them may then use. Now, I'll only briefly raise the questions about the creation of community upon arrival. And here I know what I know most about is the Australian example. And as I said last time, I'm really interested to know how that stacks up, how that compares with the American one. In Australia, for the Russians who arrived, the Russian Orthodox Church is the pillar, and really literally an awful lot of the early activity involves building such churches, physically creating a building in which to celebrate as Russian Orthodox. Well, not only Russian, but the Russians were certainly doing this energetically. Now here in Australia, you did not have a large first wave Russian immigrant community. Therefore, you didn't have very many existing churches, but they sprung up in all the areas where the migrants were. They started even in the migrant camps when you first arrived, that there were priests among the displaced person, and these priests would start to hold services, and often that gathered the beginnings of what became a congregation which lived in the area of the camp that they'd been put in after release and built an actual church. As in the camps, within the Russian-speaking community, emigres, that is people who've been in the first wave of immigration, who've gone to Europe after the revolution, and then after the Second War come to Australia, they tended to take the lead over former Soviet citizens. Indeed, those who were former Soviet citizens continued the various evasive practices acquired at the DP camps of pretending not to be former Soviet citizens. So, because we're already now in a Cold War situation in Australia, despite the very strong anti-communism of the Russian migrant community, which is another characteristic. Nevertheless, the fact that they were Russians suggested to Australia that they're red. Russia is red, and therefore anybody who's a Russian is a bit suspicious. So, so that was a factor. And then the last thing that was very important in community building, there's theatre and so on, but the Scouts in Australia, at any rate, was really big thing. It's very rare to find a memoir of a Russian who arrived in Australia in the post-war, who wasn't in some way involved in the Scout movement, either as a young person going to Scouts or as a Scoutmaster. Men and women are both very much involved in that. Now, when I think think about Australian North American differences, in formation of community after arrival, after the Second World War, one of the things that seems to me, there are two things that stand out. One in Australia is I think that not a big first wave Russian community. So there's not really a large community to join. It is more a matter that the newly arrived people creating communities, setting up the churches, setting up the scout troops, etc. Now, the other thing is that more or less at the same time, although a little bit later than the displaced persons, Russian displaced persons are arriving from Europe, you have the Russians from China arriving in Australia in large numbers. And they are a different lot, they many differences between the two. They usually arrive as families, often in touch with, often alongside other members of their community back in Harbin or wherever. And so there's much more of a network that they arrive with. The many fewer single people than single people. The displaced persons are often arrive as single people, and rarely with that kind of social network. The Harbin is how they normally refer to the China lot, though of course many are from Shanghai and Tianjin. They are much more confident in a certain way in Australian context. They don't have the same feeling of, well, there are probably two things politically that scare the displaced persons in Australia. One is the thought that they might be accused of being communists because they're Russian. The other one that they might be accused of being Nazi collaborators. And that was a big issue, and definitely a sort of mid-level serious issue in Australian Parliament. That is, the Jewish organizations raised questions about are we letting in Nazis and so on, and it continued for several years. So there are those two sets of things they're worried about. The China people are not worried about either, on the whole. Now, there's a whole story, of course, about what happens in the church with priests who have been under the Moscow Patriarchate, encountering priests who've been under Russian Church of Rule, but I think time's running out, so I won't go into that. Now, I'll just briefly say something about the stories told about displacement. Getting back to the question of once you're in your new setting, what do you say about the past, if you say anything? The favorite story in the Russian, in the Australian Russian community was a variant of "I chose freedom." In other words, I was for those who admitted, well, really for both, because the pre-war emigres chose freedom over the revolution, so to speak, and the others gave a story which was more a sort of gulag-inflected one. But in other words, I chose against communism is a big story. Another very frequent, when we're talking about individual life stories, extraordinary high proportion of people from the nobility, really striking. And in other words, it can't be true. I think that it's far too high. But people, what the story they like to tell about themselves was that my family was an aristocratic family. We lived in a palace in St. Petersburg, and then came the revolution, and we lost everything. But we fought in the White Army as officers, of course. There were no men, no rank and file soldiers ever reached Australia, I think, only officers. So that is that story. There is, to some degree, in the story told by the actual migrants, and particularly in the story when their children told their stories, the pawns of fate is very much influenced, very much part of the story. In other words, I, as a displaced person, lost all agency. I could in no way control my fate. I was subject to the sort of randomness of global events, and that randomness picked me up from Samara or wherever I was and took me all through all these strange places and then dropped me in rural Victoria. So there's that story. Now I mean, in part, of course, in a certain way, it's a very convincing story. But if you look in closer detail at the behavior of displaced persons, they are in fact exercising agency all the time. I mean, the processes I've talked about deciding what nationality would be most advantageous, which place is most likely to take you, and how should you present yourself? I mean, what is this about agency? But that it's not agency that people, they don't want to remember their agency, even when in a way, you know, when you read it, if you actually get an account of it, as with Misha's mother, who was full of agency, you know, it's terribly impressive and admirable, even if she cuts a few corners and sort of breaks a few rules from time to time. But that's not the way. That's not the favored. The favored narrative is the born of fate one. Now, a story is not told. Collaboration is, of course, a story not told. Complexities of nationality, a story is not told. After I wrote Mishka's War, which, among other things, described how he had a complex national identity in Riga, which became a simple national identity as a displaced person. All kinds of people, usually Latvians, contacted me and said, actually, this is, you know, this is my family's story too. We were in Riga, we were Riga Germans or whatever we were, or and there was this and that conflict in the family because of two different national groups being joined. And that was all sort of straightened out. Now, I said this had some interesting consequences in terms of who you associated with. Yeah. Sorry.
Do you want to
Sorry, this is a chest infection I picked up. Not COVID, one has to keep saying that. You know what I think I might do, because I'll stop coughing in a minute, is I've got some more things to say about diaspora, but why don't we see if anybody's got some questions, comments, and while I see. I don't think so. I think it's fine.
Okay, so that's a great idea. There could also, I would like to say to the webinar attendees that you're welcome to type in questions. Yeah. I hope they're hearing. Sure, please.
Hi, my name's Alex, and I was really interested in what you're talking about use the phrase like producing a file self. Like, I thought that's so interesting. And I guess also this like questions like, wait, like, you know, you can skip over me, but I'm just like really interested in the idea of like, or like the ways that people resisted by forging these different identities, and how like in for example, the contemporary age in the United States, the US Patriot Act, like that's kind of in a lot of ways impossible. Of like you have this electronic trace of every time, like applying for a credit card, like literally just like all these small things you have to keep giving your identity. And it seems like it's almost impossible to in many ways to create these forgeries and like resist the surveillance that comes with these documentations. And I had this anecdote that I like to, I don't know, I'm a little bit all scattered. I'm also recovering from something, so my brain's not quite in the right place. But is there like, in your research, did you find any instances of documentation being important or useful to people in these like transitory stages of like being migrants or being displaced? Like, is there any merit to documentation, or is it really only a tool of surveillance by the state?
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point you raise, and of course, it does really feel like an age of innocence, doesn't it? When you think of a situation where you can say at the end of a war, well, I lost all my documents and the city I was born in was bombed, so there's no birth certificate, but I am so and so. And I mean, now it is so complex. But on the other hand, my stories about my 3 passports
Right,
indicate some of the
right.
complexities within this,
Yeah.
doesn't it? Because while it would be, I mean, in each case, there was a process. I mean, the Australian passport I got because I was born there, although I lost it when I got the British passport, and so I subsequently reclaimed it. So even there's a process. There's a process in which I had to submit documents and so on. And I think it would have been, yeah, I mean, perhaps a good forger, perhaps somebody really skilled in that could have done some fancy stuff. But as far as I was concerned, I was hemmed in by a documentary sort of regime. Now, whether there's is there a sort of essential, are any of the documents true as opposed to being useful? I mean, well, are they? Is there a utility to this documentation other than for states to keep an eye on you, and international organizations, by the way, as well, not just states. I don't know. I would actually be interested to hear other people's responses to that. I certainly, I myself had a reaction, a sort of, not, this is not a utility reaction, this is a truth reaction. When I got a British passport in 1966 because I wanted to go to the Soviet Union to do research, and I couldn't do it as an Australian because there was no Australian exchange, and so I had to become British, and it was purely instrumental. It was absolutely instrumental for that specific purpose. And so I did it, and I did it by marriage, basically. So, and the British would not accept they would not give you passports in your maiden name if you asked in those days. Therefore, my Australian passport had said I was Sheila Fitzpatrick, and my British passport said I was Mrs. Sheila Bruce. And I looked, and then they didn't give me back my Australian passport, which I didn't know would happen. I didn't know the Australian case. And I looked at that, and I was absolutely appalled. I thought there was a real person here, Sheila Fitzpatrick, and she has disappeared. In her place is a completely unreal person, Sheila Bruce, who has no history, no parents, no, did she speak? What English accent does she have? And English, you do have class and regional accents. Well, she's unreal. There was an extremely strong reaction of rejection and anger. And so that I always, I mean, when I used that passport, I really always felt, I felt as if, in a way, that I was involved in a fraud, and also that the whole situation was sort of fraudulent. But as I described in Spy in the Archives, it did work out well for me in a way, in that after I'd been in Russia for a year or so as an exchange student, I published my first article in Soviet studies. And one of the people who did the bourgeois falsifying article, they used to publish periodically articles about bourgeois falsifiers based on their reading of the Western press. So they read this article, which in the British manner was called by S. Fitzpatrick, not Sheila, S. Fitzpatrick, and it was it appeared in a big, in one of the major circulation Moscow dailies, he who is obliged to hide the truth. And it said this person, there are a couple of people, these people are the next thing to spies, because they come to the Soviet Union and all they want to do is to find out dirty secrets. Which was an interesting thing for me, because I thought, indeed historians do, don't they? So does that make them spies? But the thing is that I was in Moscow at the time this article came out about S. Fitzpatrick being the next thing to a spy. But I never had any problem because I was Shabrius.
Yes, so how are you feeling? Would you like to tell us more about
Should I
diaspora, or would you prefer to?
I'll just say a bit about diaspora, what my voice is there. This is really a thought about, I mean, one of the things that's been in my mind is how, for all of us who work on Russia, there are major problems about our sources and our access to the place. And whenever this conversation comes up, I always am able to say, well, I'm sort of lucky because I've got this parallel track of working on immigration. But basically, diaspora is a topic that exists within social history and of course outside, but kind of all on its own, not very well integrated, it seems to me, with other aspects of social history. There is in the literature specifically on diaspora, there is an unresolved question about what is a diaspora? Is a diaspora, does that only apply to groups of people who are living not in their country because of some trauma, of eviction, of loss? In other words, does it have to be that kind of story? Or can you call a diaspora, can you call a group of people who are living in the country other than their own, as traders or whatever, can you call them a diaspora too? And so there's a sort of there's an ambiguity in this topic, but nevertheless, it seems to me to be one that deserves just much more study. If you're looking at migration, for example, of let's say, and this comes up particularly when you look at migration to Australia of Russians. Most Russians who went to Australia did not necessarily have it as their first choice. It was the place they got to. It then becomes, both for Russians and for Jews and for Ukrainians, it becomes highly relevant that there are other places, other centers of diaspora of your national group. You've got an option, in other words. If you've got an uncle in New York, you know, the cousin in Canada, but you've arrived in Melbourne. Conceptually, it is much easier for you to think of going to another part of the diaspora as it's a less it doesn't have the same extremely uprooting aspects of that would have to simply go to another place. I mean, it's a singular noun, but on the other hand, all diasporas are full of complex interrelationships of subgroups, right? And that's where I find I find that it's really an undeveloped area of scholarship. You have, of course, polemic from contemporary polemic, where one group attacks another group in small periodicals and so on. But it doesn't really get written about. And in connection with this trip, I was going down the Bakhmeti holding to look at the memoirs, basically, and what do people tell in their memoirs. And what I want to know, I'm particularly looking for Russians who second wave immigrants who came to New York. But this is not the story that people do basically tell in their memoirs. They tell about how they were in the emigration in Paris before the war, about how they fought in the Civil War or fought in the Revolution or whatever. In other words, these are the very rarely, judging by my recent scanning of the Bakhmeti files, do people actually think that in writing their memoirs they should talk about the place they ended up. But there is an exception. In Australia, people, they set up a journal, some Russians, the Harbin Russians, set up a journal called Australiada. So by its name, it suggests this is a journal about Russians in Australia. And they specialized in collecting memoirs and eliciting memoirs and interviewing people. In those circumstances, when they were told that the interest here is not only on the backstory before you came, although we are very interested in that, it's interested in what happened, and it also involves a sort of success story. You know, we want to put down that these people had. And so I can find for Australia much more detailed information about the later fate of the migrants than I have yet found a way of finding in the US context. So so basically that my diaspora section at the end of the paper was basically saying, here's a good thing for a lot of people to write on.
As a Russian journalist, I'm now closely following the developments in all ex-Soviet countries that experienced waves of migration. The first after the war had started, and then to the mobilization was announced, particularly after that. But one of it's a peculiar situation because in those situations during the wars, it's the women and children who migrate, but from Russia, it's young males who are live in the country, either in a position or just because they don't want to serve. Was it kind of the same situation in Australia with lots of young males coming to this new situation and somehow changing the local context or affecting the local population in a way?
After the Second World War?
Yeah.
If there were more men, yes, partly, but the population they're drawing from, the displaced persons population, was formed in two ways, one of which favored males and the other of which didn't necessarily. In other words, prisoners of war tend to be, well, they almost all, they're going to be male. But forced laborers, the Germans took both young men and young women to Germany, and therefore there are quite a few of them in that there's display. In other words, it's a different set of the foundational circumstances that produce well, I mean, as you say, the Ukrainian, the Russian one is really strongly skewed in the opposite direction. Yeah, so and indeed it would be fascinating to read more about that. I did in my passports book, passports article in the LRB. One of the things I was actually looking at the I was wondering about the process of the gendering of the Ukrainian departures. In other words, because men not of military age could leave, I assume, but I didn't have the sense that they were leaving in large numbers. It seemed a very large, the female strongly predominant. But then I came across this really strange story about a Ukrainian who had done a gender change, and which way was it? Yes, that's right. An Ukrainian born as a man, changed to woman, and then wanted to leave but changed to woman, but didn't do it formally because that is hard, if not impossible. And I think in both Russia and Ukraine, and then found unable to leave along with other women because of being considered because of being eligible for military service, basically. And that story interested me because it was told, it was in an American correspondent wrote it up with great sympathy for the person. Now I could imagine it being written up in a different way as a new kind of scam. I mean, in a Russian press conference context, I don't think anybody did write it up. But that is just a sort of one strange little episode that I came across, and I haven't. Do you know of anybody who's really been working on that, thinking about those questions of the gendering of the different new?
I am now. It's my idea for the MA thesis, so I'm researching that question now.
Oh, good, good. So
I know actually, and I can recommend it. The book by Ludmila Valenska-Flam, by the way. She's a DB person from Latvia, from Riga.
Oh, yeah.
Her husband. And now she lives in Florida. I can connect you with her.
Yeah.
She's a friend of mine, and she's an American journalist. She worked for 50 years in America. And she published very good research, about 500 pages, stories of displaced persons in Germany. And then I can recommend you resources from Museum of Russian Culture in San Francisco, because most of them are from Tubabao Island.
Yes.
You know this story.
Yes, well, that's that.
Yes.
Yes.
And actually, a brilliant person lives nearby New York. This is Reverend Georgi Larin. He is displaced person from Tubabao to Australia and then to the United States.
Oh, will you give me those?
He is still alive.
Could you possibly?
Sure,
Yeah.
with my pleasure, with my pleasure. And actually, I brought a book for you, especially for you. Very exciting research from German scholars, Helena Kulin. She works with German archives, and she uses unique materials, absolutely unique materials, documents.
Not Bremen.
Pardon?
The Bremen archives in Bremen, or
No, not Bremen, not Bremen. I show you her research, and this is something, trust me. So,
well, you know,
and thank you so much for your lecture.
Oh, well.
It's very useful and very exciting and very important for us.
Oh, well,
because the United States accepted 500,000 DPs after the war.
Yes,
yes,
yes, you're very. The Museum of Russian Culture in San Francisco. If only they had. I mean, they're terribly helpful in printing, but if only they had a better catalog. Because I was trying to work on that in lockdown. Otherwise, I could have got a plane to San Francisco from Sydney. But anyway,
I'm good.
Yes.
There's a question in the chat here from Ruth Ullman, who's a PhD student in history, actually specializing in the 18th century, but she has a question. She says, I had some trouble hearing. Apologies if the question is misguided as the result. You mentioned there was an influx of Ukrainian refugees coming to Australia after the war, but it was only after a Russian wave of refugees that the Orthodox churches began to be built. Do you know why that was the case?
Oh, well, I think I probably wasn't very clear. The Russians and Ukrainians, I'm not absolutely sure. The thing was that there were 5,000 people before the war in Australia who were identified in the census as Russian. Now that is likely to include a lot of people who subsequently might identify as Ukrainian, but that was not, Ukrainian was not a category that the Australian census recognized until 1947. Therefore, it isn't really possible to know, to say anything with certainty on that. I think of course, both in the Second World War migration stream, there were Russians and Ukrainians, and both built churches. But I know more about the Russians. I imagine that they behave very similarly in their separate communities, but I've only really researched the Russian.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And I think I want to ask you if you can elaborate a bit more the idea of agency of displaced people, because you mentioned the example of the churches, and I found this extremely interesting. But I wonder if you know something about school education programs or some activities for children. I ask because, like, the case of the churches reminds me a case of immigrants after the 1917 in North Africa. And I know that they also start to build churches, Orthodox churches there. But also the other side of the activity was to organize schools or kindergartens for the children in Russian language. And I just wonder if there was something like this in Australia. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if so there's a general agency question there, but also the question of in what ways what kind of initiatives people take. So let me start from the second one. Churches were the main, the first thing that people built, and in physical terms, the buildings that they built they built buildings in which to hold services, but also the next thing was as aged care homes. That was the next kind of, and that came quite quickly. For the Saturday schools, the language schools, they didn't build in Australia Russian general schools for Russians. That was not on. They went to the state schools. But what the Russian parents would normally do is, and not just the Russian, it was the migrant parents would send the children to Saturday school for the language. But that didn't require a building. In other words, I mean, you borrowed a building from a school or
The church.
yeah, or the church, yes, yes. And the sort of broader question of agency, I emphasize agency in part because, well, I mean, my material suggested to me that there was a lot of possibility of exercise of agency, but also I emphasized it because so strongly the narrative that was coming across in other sources was the pawns of fate one, the one that denies any agency was involved. So I mean, like all these things, I mean, you know, there's agency and there's also being a pawn of fate. I mean, there are the big processes that you're not in control of. There's the big wave that jumps you somewhere, but then you scrabble around trying to find your feet some way. And all of that scrabbling around trying to find your feet, that comes from me under the heading of agency. And the creative ways of presenting yourself, I consider that also to be agency.
I've just been reading Machiavelli in our contemporary civilization class, and you're making me think of the fantastic quotes that you can use as an epigraph from, he does it in The Prince, where he talks about the fortune or fate as a river overflowing its banks, which you can't escape, and yet you still have to construct dikes and build houses around and protect them and fences. So no matter if you know at some point you're going to be swept away, but you still have to intervene and shape your life
That's
in
great.
some way. Yes,
I once taught The Prince too, but it was a while back.
yes.
Yeah, you know, another quite useful conceptual framework that I find is from cybernetics and the sciences is self-organization. And this is in the context of thinking of chaotic systems, which are not random. But there's no prediction in a chaotic system, but you've got patterns, you've got regularities, but they're not uniform and then they're not permanent and so on. But basically self-organization is a tendency of molecules, and I also consider people to start organizing. They're in the middle of turbulence, they get out of the main area of turbulence and start making some pattern. And it seems to me this is what diasporas are doing all the time. And people who migrate some kind of self-organization, which is collective. I mean, it involves organizing not just your molecule, but you the molecule, but in relation to all the other ones. And I think that is a useful way of thinking of that. And it occurs at local level. The state may be saying all kinds of things, but at local level, you've got this kind of self-organization going on.
I was really interested in the moment when you talked about the connection with the first waivers and the DPs, and that they all need this understanding that procuring documents that can prove that you're stateless actually is better in the post-World War II. And so as you were talking about it, I kind of imagined that, okay, the immigration of the first wave is helping the second wave produce system polls, that's passports and documents demonstrating that they're stateless. So I was wondering, did that actually happen? And what sort of infrastructure did the immigration as a whole create to facilitate this process?
Yes, it certainly did happen. And I mean, often, that is often, no, your question is completely appropriate, because often it's sort of just a question, well, everybody said it happened kind of thing. But in this case, I think it can be better documented in Mönchhof, which was a big basically NTS camp, very independently set up and run. The dominant group, the camps had had elected administrations. And the people elected as the people running the camp in Mönchhof were stateless, were white, were first wave Russians. But the majority of the camp population was apparently they did some sort of informal surveys, and these were people of Soviet origin, but they were people of Soviet origins who very definitely didn't want to be repatriated. And so in the memoirs, there are memoirs of several of the people who were in administrators in this camp, and they talk about devoting a particular room and having particular people work on the provision of stateless documents, NATs and passports, I suppose, or perhaps simply DP cards, which said stateless for the people of Soviet origin. There's also, I think, fairly well documented similar activity coming out of the Russian Church abroad in Hamburg, and probably largely regional, but the intent was to help whoever they could find, but who they would tend to find in practice were the people who were closest to them. Now, they're not the only people in town who were doing this service, but that's two lots of people who were offering this service, as it were, on principled grounds. There were also all kinds of just commercial, in other words, it's part of the black market was getting false documents.
Could you say a little bit more about, you didn't talk too much about the reaction of Australians to the displaced. You mentioned the reaction in Parliament, the idea among Jews to the idea that they might be Nazis, but it seems like, at least in America, you can't talk about immigrants without discussing the kind of reaction or exclusion from the dominant society, or the way different ways of immigrants were perceived here. And it seems to me that if Australia was in some way akin to, waves of immigrants coming, there would be social status differentiations or discriminatory or, prejudicial kind of generalizations made about a large group of newcomers. Did you come across anything like that?
Oh, yeah, there's a complicated story of that. Now, with the Russians, it is in part complicated because a lot of them came, really a lot of the displaced persons who would normally identify as Russian came under other nationalities, Polish, Yugoslav, and the Australians. You remember I said that Australia had a hierarchy of preferred nationalities. Russians wasn't even on that at one point. But somebody from one of the Australian officials who was in Europe, he wrote back and said, should we put Belarusians on it? And the Australian said, well, who are they? What does it mean? And different opinions were expressed within the bureaucracy. One said it's white Russians, those ones who emigrated, but the other one said it's people who come from Belarus, from the area whose capital is Minsk. So I think the issue of exactly who these Belarusians are was unresolved, but they got on the list, relative, in a reasonable middle kind of position. But Russians were never on the list. Now that is a matter of they were in the census, so in one sense it was recognized, but immigration didn't. Australian immigration didn't recognize it. So then the Russians come and they're building their churches, but they're really keeping quite a low profile. And also, although there are comparatively a lot of Russians, I mean, we're talking 20,000 or so, come after the war, that number is dwarfed by the number who are coming from Greece, Italy, Malta, Mediterranean people. Now, in Australian terms, Australian immigration before the war had been overwhelmingly British. So that to have anybody coming who doesn't speak your language is quite different situation from America. Really what upset the strongest opposition came to the Italians and the Greeks, who were there in large numbers, who were not, whereas the Russians were, the Cold War was a problem for them, Russia is red and all that. There is a sense that, and then there's a fear that the Soviets will come and kidnap them, and so there's a bit of a low profile kind of thing. Whereas the Italians and the Greeks were not low profile. And the Italians in particular actually had communists among the migrants. So, there was, so that's, a lot of it is about that. Now, the issue I mentioned about Nazi collaborators, that arose in an odd way. After the war, when Australia decided we're not going to be able to get enough British migrants, we got to get other people. They first hit on the DPs. I mean, it was pointed out to them, here's a group of people that need a place, and you want people, so we take your DPs. But then by about 1950, you'd run out of DPs, and Australia still wants some. And there is a strong feeling in some quarters in Australia that Germans, many of whom would like to immigrate, would be really good migrants because they're hardworking, well organized, clean, etc. That whole rhetoric. Therefore, the new Conservative government, it had been a Labour government, which probably would have not been too keen on the Germans, given it was so close after the war. But the Conservative government said, we'll bring in Germans. And it's at that point that the Jewish organizations start protesting about the bringing in of Germans. And then that protest, then they start saying, well, it's not only a question of these proposed German migrants, but what about all the displaced persons? If we're talking collaborators, and so then people start bringing up cases of this and that, Latvian or whatever, who against whom a case has been made for war crimes. But the Russians were collectively often referred to as Balts in Australia because the first lot of displaced persons was from the Baltic. So and there is a certain amount of anecdotal evidence says that in the schools, for example, you got a bit of harassment as a Balt. And the Harbin people got a bit of harassment as Chinese. So, but Russians were not, it was at a low level. There were lots of people who are objecting to lots of categories, but Russian isn't high on the list of their objections.
Can I actually building off that question? I mean, right now, obviously, in the current environment, we talk a lot about what do states do to integrate the newcomers. Like, I understand that schooling. It seems to me that the idea of the state is to prevent the diasporic formation, right? Because they might see it as a threat. Let's say, like the examples that you've already given. So, what did the Australian state do to either integrate them, right? Or like, let's say, to spread out what America usually does, right? Let's spread them out across the United States. Or B, to actually, sort of help them to maintain their local level communities and let them do their own thing, leave them alone. So,
it's a really interesting question because the Australian state had a very straightforward assimilationist approach. They need to be helped to become Australian as quickly as possible. And the way we will help them do that, well, first of all, I should perhaps mention that there was a strong economic motive about taking them. So we're going to assign them to basically indentured labor for two years. And hopefully that will assimilate them. But basically then we want to encourage assimilation by helping them learn English, by setting up good neighbor councils. Those were the two things that they did. But they don't do them terribly intensively. And this is done at the federal level, the Commonwealth level. We actually have a project running on this at the moment, which is the assimilationist rhetoric. But the practice on the ground, if you look at local councils, for example, is quite different. Because at local councils, there is always the issue of conflict in schools, conflict in a neighborhood. If these Russians want to build a church, or Serbs or Ukrainians, whoever they are, if they want to build a church, maybe we don't want them as neighbors, maybe they'll make a noise. That was so. Well, it's a sort of self-organization thing. The state is saying yes, assimilation and we'll scatter. They will scatter. Not we will scatter them through the economy. They will scatter themselves. But in practice, of course, people tend to go to live in the place where there are other people that they know, where there are the Saturday schools, where there's church and so on. And so that just at the same time that the state is talking, the federal state is talking assimilation. The practice in the localities is the formation of different migrant communities, of ethnic communities, which are essentially invisible in a sense to the people who don't live close to them. And that situation obtains until about the 1980s, when Australia embraces multiculturalism. And there's the switch, in other words, the central attitude switch is in a way which, I mean, it was both more liberal in intent, but it also did accommodate realities that all these migrant groups had formed ethnic communities. And everybody knew, impressionistically, everybody knew that the Italians, the Italian restaurants were in this suburb and so on. Everybody, I mean, that they wouldn't always know about Russians because it's a smaller group. So that was, yes, that was the only twist in that. Everybody, all the migrants gave lip service to assimilation. I mean, their representatives always said, yes, our main objective is to make ourselves new Australians, was the term, to make ourselves new Australians. But the Jewish community, there was already a Jewish community in situ, and a lot of Jews that had come just before the war and after. Jewish community basically said, we're not so keen on assimilation. Doesn't sound good to us. And that statement was made in a variety of contexts in the press and so on. And there was never any sort of reaction from the Commonwealth or from any level of government. Nobody ever said, but our policy is assimilation, so you go along with it. It was sort of tacitly accepted, but completely not commented on. Completely not commented on. Everybody else had said, yes, assimilation is great. And the Jews said, not for us. And so there's no end of topic.
All right, so we seem to be more or less at the end of our time. So I think we're all extremely grateful. I for one am very grateful as one of your subjects, having been a graduate of the church school, and a grandfather who built the churches. I can't believe anyone is actually interested in this. So I'm just having the time of my life. Thank you so much for telling this wonderful story with all its twists and many individual stories, of course, that flow into it to make it a whole. So thank you so much. So wonderful to have you here in reality and not only on a screen. So, thank you.
Everyone for coming. Hope to see you at one o'clock. So Sheila, did the Scouts cut against that by kind of de facto assimilating the later generations? You said there was a lot of activity in the Scouts. In the Scouts. Didn't you say that?